Canada looks like the responsible adult in the G7. Polite, stable, sensible, and yet, millions of people are living inside a financial haunted house. Here's the myth. Canada is rich because it's well managed. Housing goes up because that's what housing does. Homeowners getting rich is proof the system works. Now the reality. Housing didn't just grow inside Canada's economy. It started to eat the economy, pulling money, politics, and incentives into one giant gravity well. Canada didn't build a stronger economy. It built a bigger housing market and called it prosperity. Imagine an economy like a body. Businesses are the muscles. Innovation is the brain. Wages are the bloodstream. In Canada, housing became the stomach, and it's been swallowing everything else. Savings, into the stomach, investment, into the stomach, policy, seasoned, plated, and served to the stomach. At this point, the National Growth Plan is basically, have you tried buying a condo? And here's the cruel joke: when house prices rise, it feels like everyone's winning. Like a party where the music keeps getting louder. But under the floorboards, the wiring is melting. Because when your main engine of wealth is paper value prices, not productivity, you start treating real estate like a national sport, and everything else like a hobby. Halfway through this story, a lot of people ask, okay, but who caused this? And the uncomfortable answer is, almost everyone participated. Not out of evil, out of incentives. Households chasing security, banks chasing safe profits, cities chasing tax revenue, investors chasing returns, politicians chasing votes. A machine with no single villain, just 1,000 tiny levers, all pulling in the same direction. So this documentary is a guided tour of the trap. 7 reasons housing swallowed Canada's economy, and why getting out is harder than getting in. Because the thing about a trap is, it doesn't look like a trap when you're being fed. First up, the wealth illusion: how getting richer on paper can quietly make a country poorer in real life. So, what happens when a nation's biggest success story is also its biggest dependency? Reason 1. The wealth illusion. In Canada, a rising home price isn't just a number, it's an emotion. It's dinner table confidence. It's retirement daydreams. It's the smug comfort of thinking you made it, because your walls appreciated faster than your skills. Myth. This is prosperity. Reality. This can be paper wealth, and paper wealth has a funny habit. It feels like strength, right up until you try to use it as an economy. Here's the trick. When home values soar, people feel richer. They spend a little more. They borrow a little more. They renovate, they refinance. They buy a second place for the kids. The country starts to look busy, shiny, and successful. But being busy isn't the same as being productive. If an economy is a garden, productivity is the soil. Businesses are the plants, wages are the fruit, and housing is the decorative fountain. It looks impressive. It makes nice sound effects, but you can't eat the fountain. When too much wealth comes from higher prices instead of higher output, you end up confusing inflation with achievement. A house selling for more doesn't mean the country built more value. It just means the ticket price to live there got higher, and that has consequences. Because to turn paper wealth into real life, somebody else has to pay it. Every gain on one side of the ledger becomes a heavier backpack on the other. First-time buyers, renters, young families, new workers, people who didn't buy in time. The wealth exists, but it's trapped inside the same asset, bouncing between owners like a hot potato nobody wants to drop. Kicker: Canada didn't discover gold, it discovered each other's down payments. And when housing becomes the main scoreboard, other scoreboards start getting ignored. Business investment looks boring. Innovation looks risky. Building a company takes years. Owning a home takes one lucky purchase. And a decade of everyone else suffering politely. Rehook. Here's the question that should keep you awake. If your country feels richer, but it can't build enough homes, can't raise wages fast enough, and can't invest like it used to, what exactly is getting richer? Because once you worship price gains, you start designing the whole system to protect them. And that's where the trap deepens. So if paper wealth is the illusion, what's the weapon that turned it into a national strategy? Reason 2. The leverage ladder. Myth. Canadians got rich because they saved, invested, and built solid careers. Reality. A huge chunk of the wealth story came from doing something way simpler. Borrowing larger and larger amounts against the same pile of land. This is the part where housing stops being shelter and starts being a financial product with a kitchen attached. Leverage is a ladder. When prices climb, the ladder feels sturdy. You step up, you feel smart, you tell yourself it's responsible, because everyone else is doing it. Then prices climb again. And suddenly, the ladder becomes the strategy. In Canada, mortgages became the great national amplifier. Not because people were reckless cartoon villains, because the system quietly encouraged it. Banks like mortgages because homes are collateral. Borrowers like mortgages because wages don't buy homes anymore. Governments like rising prices because it looks like growth and keeps voters calm. And cities like it because the alternative is admitting the game is broken. So households climb. First home, then a bigger home, then a refinance, then a rental condo, Then equity becomes a personality trait. And here's the twist. Leverage doesn't just magnify gains, it magnifies fragility. If you buy an asset with a lot of borrowed money, a small price drop can feel like a trapdoor. Monthly payments can rise if rates rise, especially for certain mortgage structures and renewals in Canada, where many borrowers reset into new rates over time. That timing and how it works varies, so the specifics matter here. Verify, but the broader point is simple. When a country ties household confidence to a leveraged asset, it becomes allergic to price declines. Kicker: if housing is your retirement plan, a correction isn't market health, it's a personal insult. And that's how leverage turns into politics. Because once enough people are holding the same fragile ladder, everyone becomes emotionally invested in keeping it from wobbling. Media narratives soften. Policy gets cautious. Risk gets treated like an inconvenience. Rehook. Here's the scary question: what happens when the safest bet in the country becomes borrow more, so you can buy what already exists? That's the moment housing stops being an outcome and becomes a mission. And missions don't like obstacles. Which brings us to the next problem. Even if Canada wanted to build its way out, why does it feel like supply moves at the speed of a sleepy bureaucracy? Reason 3. The supply wall. Myth: if housing is expensive, just build more. Reality: building more is not a single button. It's a long obstacle course, and Canada turned the obstacle course into a national hobby. Housing supply isn't controlled by one person with a hard hat. It's controlled by a slow machine. Zoning rules, permits, hearings, appeals, neighborhood politics. A process so layered that by the time a new building is approved, the original architect has emotionally moved on and started a podcast. And here's the quiet detail most people miss. Local governments often depend heavily on property-related revenue, and they also deal with the costs of growth. The incentives can get weird. Verify, so you end up with a system that says, "We need more housing," while acting like housing is a dangerous chemical spill. Developers aren't saints, but they're not wizards either. If every project takes years of uncertainty, extra fees, and political risk, only a certain kind of project survives. The safest bet becomes luxury units or whatever can absorb delays. Meanwhile, the basic stuff people actually need: family-sized homes, rentals that don't require a trust fund, get stuck in the queue. Picture the supply system like a clogged artery. Demand keeps pumping, prices keep spiking, and instead of clearing the blockage, the country buys a nicer stethoscope. Kicker: Canada didn't create a housing shortage, it created a housing waiting room. And the waiting room has a bouncer, not always on purpose. Sometimes it's fear, traffic, schools, change, shadows, parking. Sometimes it's politics. I support housing, just not that housing. Not here, not now. That's how you get a country where everyone agrees there's a crisis, and yet the crisis keeps renewing its lease. Rehook: if supply is this slow, prices don't need a conspiracy, they just need time. And time is exactly what the machine consumes. Quick pause. If this is hitting home, subscribe. Not because it fixes housing, just because it's cheaper than a down payment. Because when supply can't respond, the economy adapts in the worst possible way. People don't stop needing homes. They start competing harder for the same limited stock. And then demand gets weaponized by credit, speculation, and population growth pressures that collide with scarcity. So what happens when you have a supply wall, and you keep feeding it demand like it's a bonfire? Myth: prices are high because people are greedy. Reality: demand is not one thing. It's a whole engine made of population growth, credit conditions, investor behavior, and a culture trained to believe housing only goes up. Think of the market like a small lifeboat. Now keep adding passengers, then hand out oars, but only to people who already have seats. Then start charging more for the same patch of wood. That's not a moral failure, that's physics. Demand grows in a few ways at the same time. 1. More people need homes. Canada has had strong population growth in recent years, and housing supply hasn't always kept pace. The exact breakdown and timing matters. Verify: when more households form faster than homes get built, the competition gets uglier. 2. Credit conditions can turn that competition into a bidding war. When borrowing is easier or feels cheaper, buyers can reach further, not because they're evil, because they're scared. Fear is a powerful currency. And in a shortage, fear gets interest rates. 3. Speculation. Not always the cartoon version, someone flipping condos like pancakes. Sometimes it is normal people doing what the system taught them. If you guarantee by now, you'll never buy, so they stretch. Parents help. Friends co-sign. People treat a mortgage like a career move. And once that mindset spreads, housing becomes less like a market and more like musical chairs with debt. Kicker: nothing builds national unity like everyone competing for the same two-bedroom. Rehook: here's what makes the engine truly dangerous. Demand can surge quickly, supply responds slowly. So the pressure doesn't release, it concentrates. That concentration shows up everywhere. Rents climb, commutes stretch, young adults postpone families. Workers move away from opportunity. and entire industries start organizing around housing instead of around producing things. This is where the trap gets psychological. Because when housing is the main way to build wealth, people stop asking, is this good for the economy? They start asking, is this good for my equity? And that's how a country can look stable while quietly becoming brittle. A booming market on the outside, a stressed society underneath. So now, we've got paper wealth, leverage, a supply wall, and a demand engine. But here's the bigger question. What happens to the rest of the economy when all the money, attention, and ambition get sucked into housing like a vacuum? Because that's where the real damage shows up. In productivity, reason 5. The productivity trade-off. Myth: a strong housing market means a strong economy. Reality: a strong housing market can become a parasite. Economy: one that grows by feeding on the energy that should be gone into building new value. An economy has limited fuel: money, talent, political attention, risk appetite. When housing prices rise fast, housing becomes the easiest story to sell, and the easiest place to park capital. Why fund a startup that might fail, when you can buy a condo and let scarcity do the work? Why invest in machinery, research, or exports, when the biggest return in the room is a bidding war? Housing becomes the nation's favorite slot machine. You pull the lever, the reels spin, and sometimes you win without producing anything except more anxiety for the next person. Kicker: Canada found a way to make GDP feel like a group project, and housing does none of the homework. This isn't about blaming homeowners, it's about incentives that redirect the whole economy. When housing dominates, talented people follow the money. More real estate agents, more mortgage brokers, more lawyers and consultants and strategists optimizing the same asset over and over, and fewer people building scalable businesses. Even construction, real, physical work can get pulled into the wrong loop. Because you're not building a productive base, you're building more chips for the casino. And business investment matters, because it's how countries get richer without just raising prices. It's how wages grow. It's how productivity rises. It's how you escape the trap of needing constant asset inflation to feel okay. When that investment slows, you get a weird economy. Shiny in the places where wealth is stored, strained in the places where wealth is made. Rehook: here's the part that should sting. A nation can look rich, while its future gets quietly pawned off. Because the housing-first economy trains everyone to think short-term. Politicians chase headlines. Households chase equity. Banks chase safe lending. And businesses start to feel like background characters in their own story. So housing doesn't just swallow money, it swallows ambition. But there's still one more force that makes the trap self-defending: the financial system. Because once banks and balance sheets depend on housing staying strong, price stability becomes a national security issue. So how did Canada end up with a banking feedback loop where protecting housing prices feels like protecting the entire country? Reason 6. The bank feedback loop. Myth: Canadian housing is expensive because it's a free market doing free market things. Reality: housing is tangled with the financial system so tightly that market outcomes start to feel supervised. Banks sit at the center of this story like quiet engineers. They don't have to cheer for higher prices. They just have to design the pipes so the water keeps flowing. In Canada, banks are heavily exposed to mortgages in their lending portfolios, and the system includes forms of mortgage insurance and regulation that aim to manage risk. The exact structure and incentives vary, and the details matter. But the core dynamic is familiar. If housing stays stable, mortgages look safe. If mortgages look safe, banks stay stable. If banks stay stable, the whole economy feels stable. So stability becomes the sacred word, the national lullaby. And once that's the mindset, you start to see why everyone gets nervous about falling prices. A housing decline isn't just some homeowners lose money. It can tighten credit, reduce consumer spending, and stress balance sheets. That doesn't guarantee a crisis, but it creates a political fear that spreads fast. Here's the loop. Rising prices make existing borrowers look safer. Safer borrowers encourage more lending. More lending supports higher prices. Higher prices create more paper wealth. Paper wealth creates more spending and confidence pressures policymakers to protect the vibe. Kicker: the economy becomes a house of cards, except the cards are laminated. So when policymakers talk about cooling the market, it's often a careful dance, not too hot, not too cold, just enough to look responsible without breaking the spell. Rehook: notice how weird this is. We've built a system where a basic human need doubles as a financial pillar. In that world, protecting housing prices can start to feel like protecting retirement plans, bank stability, and the nation's self-image all at once. It's not a conspiracy meeting in a dark room, it's a collective reflex. And it creates a moral hazard. If everyone believes the system will step in to prevent a big fall, risk-taking gets rewarded. People stretch further. Investors push harder, because the downside feels managed. That's how a trap becomes comfortable. Like quicksand with a pillow. But comfort has a cost. Because when you protect prices long enough, you don't eliminate the problem. You store it, you compress it. You turn the future into a pressure cooker. So the next question is brutal. If the country can't or won't let housing deflate normally, what are the possible endgames? Soft landing, stagnation, shock. Let's talk scenarios. Reason 7. The endgames. This is where people demand a clean answer. Will it crash? And the honest response is annoying. There isn't one ending. There are a few, and none are painless. Myth. Canada can simply fix housing and move on. Reality. The system is now wired into everything, so the future looks less like a single event, and more like a menu of compromises. Scenario 1. The soft landing. Prices stop surging. Maybe they drift down in real terms over years, while incomes slowly catch up. This is the least dramatic option also, the hardest to pull off. It requires supply to improve, demand to cool, and credit to stay stable, all while avoiding a recession. Possible, not guaranteed. Verify Scenario 2. Stagnation. Prices don't collapse. They just sit there high, sticky, and miserable. Affordability stays broken. The economy keeps bending around housing. People delay kids, delay moves, delay life. It's not a crash, it's a slow leak. In a room where everyone pretends they can't smell it, kicker, the Canadian dream becomes congratulations. You can now afford to exist. Scenario 3. A shock. A deeper recession, a wave of forced selling, or a sharp credit tightening could push prices down faster than policymakers want. Again, might, one risk, not destiny. But if it happens, it would test the whole psychology of the country. Because so much confidence is built on the idea that housing is safe. And here's the real trap across all scenarios. Every option hurts someone. If prices fall, recent buyers feel betrayed. If prices stay high, renters and young workers get squeezed. If the government pushes hard on supply, local politics fights back. If demand is cooled, industries built around housing feel it. If credit tightens, the entire consumer economy slows. So the system tends to choose. Delay. Push the problem forward. Let time absorb the conflict. Rehook. But time isn't neutral. Time is a tax paid in mobility, family formation, productivity, and trust. And the longer it goes, the more housing becomes a political religion. Questioning it feels like heresy. Because when a country's stability depends on high home values, reality becomes negotiable. Which leads to the final argument. There is no clean solution, only choices about fairness. And everyone hates fairness when they're the one paying for it. So here asks the question I want you to sit with before we land this story. If you could choose one policy, build more housing fast, cap demand, or let prices fall, what's the least unfair option? Because once you answer that, you'll understand why Canada is stuck. And you'll understand what the real estate trap truly costs. Ready for the conclusion? So here we are. Canada, the stable country, trapped in an economy where shelter became the main investment thesis. The myth said this was smart, safe, responsible. The reality is darker. When housing becomes the engine, everything else becomes the passenger. Wages get dragged, businesses get starved. Politics becomes allergic to the idea of lower prices. And a basic human need turns into a national scoreboard. Canada didn't wake up one day and choose this. It drifted into it one incentive at a time. Paper wealth felt good. Leverage made it louder. Supply moved like molasses. Demand kept pushing. Capital chased houses instead of innovation. Banks and policymakers learned to protect the vibe. And now the country is stuck with a brutal choice. Keep prices high and lock out the next generation. Or let prices fall and shock a system built on housing can't lose. Either way, someone eats the cost. That's the real estate trap. Not a villain, a machine. And the worst part, a trap doesn't just catch you. It teaches you to defend it. So if you take one thing from this story, let it be this. Prosperity isn't when your house gets more expensive. Prosperity is when your country can build, innovate, and pay people enough to live without gambling on a postcode. If you want more documentaries like this sharp, cynical, and painfully useful, hit subscribe. I promise it's still cheaper than rent. Next, we look at another rich country with the same addiction where the middle class is being priced out in real time.